Good morning, everyone. My name is Maisie and I am going to be your educator for this lesson. This is a very quick re-recording of the live lesson that we just did about an hour and a half ago or so. We did have some technical difficulties. So we thought, what better way to just solve that problem than just re-recording everything and uploading it onto our YouTube page so that everyone can actually understand what I'm saying, because that's normally useful when we have an online class. Okay guys, so let's get started. Just before we kind of get into our topic, I do just want to reiterate once again, in case it didn't come through on the first broadcast, that just like the rest of the world, the Cayman Islands is in lockdown due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We are currently working from home. We're very lucky that we get to call this beautiful research station our home, and we are not breaking any of the government regulations. There are only two people involved in this broadcast, myself and the wonderful Jack, who is producing and now recording this behind the camera. So make sure that from wherever you're tuning in from, that you are, make sure that you're following the government regulations and you're staying at home and you're staying nice and safe. So although this is not going to be a live broadcast, if you do have any questions at all after you have watched this lesson, then please do either type them in the comments that are underneath this video, or just email them in to education@reefresearch.org and I will try to answer them as best as I possibly can. You do also have an at-home class activity sheet, which you can do alongside this broadcast or after this broadcast. A link for this will be posted. It's also all over our Facebook and our Instagram page as well. You can find us on Facebook at CCMI, the Central Caribbean Marine Institute, and on Instagram we are Reef Research. So do take a look at those and take a look at our activity sheet, because it's super fun for everyone to get involved with. Okay, so our lesson that we have today is all about coral outplanting, which essentially means when we take the corals that are in our coral nursery and we put them back and we plant them back on the reef, just like, for example, how you would plant a tree in your garden, for example. Now, before we kind of go diving underwater and we learn all about how we do this, we're actually going to do a quick recap of the last two lessons that we have had. So earlier on, this is the third part of a three-part series. Earlier on, we learned about what a coral actually is. So a coral is made out of lots of tiny animals called coral polyps, which all live inside these nice little holes that we have right here. And corals are kind of a lot like upside down jellyfish. They have these tentacles that are pointing outwards, and inside of these tentacles we have these stinging cells that are called nematocysts. So they use these tentacles to feed from the water, and that's how they get some of their food. Now, the majority of the food they actually get, though, comes from an algae that lives inside of their tissues called zooxanthellae. Now, inside of the zooxanthellae is just like any other plant, and it actually undertakes photosynthesis, which is when you have sunlight and carbon dioxide, and then this produces oxygen and lots of sugars as well. So this zooxanthellae, the algae inside of the tissues, actually gives most of its sugars to the coral, which provides it with its key food source. Now, there are lots and lots of different types of coral. I have some examples right here in front of me, and we can see they look very, very different from each other. Now, the coral that we grow in our coral nursery is called the staghorn coral, which is this one that we have right here. And the reason we grow this staghorn coral in our coral nursery is because there was actually a really big disease that went through and wiped out a lot of this population. So there used to be lots and lots of staghorn coral all over the reefs in the Caribbean, but now unfortunately it has reduced down. So we're growing this coral in our coral nursery, and we're trying to put it back out onto the reef. So Diseases, as we learned last week, are just some of the key threats that corals are actually facing. There's lots and lots of different worldwide threats. For example, we have climate change, which is causing our oceans to warm. Now, if you remember last week's broadcast, you'll remember that when it gets too hot, something called coral bleaching occurs. And this is when the zooxanthellae that's inside of the coral's tissues actually leaves the coral. So this makes it turn white because the zooxanthellae give them their color, as well as giving them all of their food. So this can cause corals to become really, really damaged. Another thing that is affecting our coral reefs as well is ocean acidification. Now, we know that the skeleton of these corals is made out of calcium carbonates, which they are really cool. They actually extract it from the seawater and build their own skeletons. But because the ocean is becoming more acidic, this is actually breaking down the coral skeletons and making it much harder for them to grow. So that's a really big threat. Another thing we learned about was the fact that when there's lots of overfishing and we're removing, for example, some of the herbivores on the reef, herbivores being creatures that eat all the plant material, then it actually means there's lots of algae that grows all over the reef as well. And we remember that this grows a lot faster than corals. So this can cause the corals to grow much slower because the algae will grow all over the top of them. And there's also some threats as well, such as coastal development and, for example, pollution, which can be really damaging for corals as well. And all of these things combined can actually make corals more susceptible to diseases, just like the one which unfortunately nearly wiped out this staghorn coral right here. So lots and lots of threats. Now, what can you guys at home do about this? We spoke about this last week. The key thing that you can do to not just help coral reefs, but also to help the environment as a whole, is to reduce down your carbon footprint. So by that, I mean trying to use less fossil fuels, so oil and gas, for example, which are going into the atmosphere and is causing all of this climate change. So for example, when we're leaving our room, we're going to make sure to turn off the lights, to turn off the AC if you're living in a hot area like we are. We could, for example, walk to the shops rather than taking the car to go, and just generally trying to, reduce down our carbon footprint and just be better for the environment. Another thing that we can make sure that we do is reduce down our plastic consumption as well, because that's a really, really big pollutant on coral reefs. We can make sure that we support lots of different environmental organizations that are doing some really, really great work. There's lots of them worldwide. And of course, we can also make sure to educate all of our friends and family about how awesome coral reefs are, but also tell them all about the threats that they're facing as well, to make sure that everyone knows that they can make a difference and they can help save coral reefs, which is what we are all about here at CCMI. Now, anyone can do any of the above things that I've listed. However, because CCMI is so lucky to be really close to the ocean, you can see it's so beautiful right behind me now, we're actually trying to take a more hands-on approach to try and reduce down some of the threats that coral reefs are facing. And this is where our coral nursery comes into play. What we're doing is we are taking small fragments of wild coral colonies, we are taking them to our coral nursery, and we are growing them in this nice environment, because in a coral nursery, some of the threats that corals face are actually kind of reduced down. So for example, there's less predators that are near the coral nursery because the corals are hanging up above the sand, and most predators will come along the sand to try and eat something. Also, this sand at the bottom is a really good place for corals to get disease, for example. So by kind of having them in this nice, stable environment in a coral nursery, they're really healthy and they're growing really fast. So staghorn coral normally grows about 10 to 20 centimeters a year in the wild, but in our coral nursery it's growing about 7 times faster. So that is super cool, and this is how we're trying to regrow the population of this staghorn coral. But where does outplanting come into all of this? And I get asked this question quite a lot, and people say, why don't you just keep the coral inside the coral nursery? Because it's nice and safe there, it's got less threats, it's growing really well. You're saying that this coral is endangered and there's not that much of it. Why not just keep it in the nice, safe nursery environment? And that's a really, really great question. And the reason why we don't keep it in our coral nursery environment is because it's so important for the whole reef health to actually go and put this coral back onto the reef. Now, the reason for this is that corals are ecosystem engineers. And an ecosystem engineer is any organism or creature that can create, modify, maintain, or destroy an environment. So this is what corals are doing. Just like how you need to have trees to be alive and to be there to have a forest, you need to make sure that you have corals in order to have a coral reef. And they're really, really important for maintaining the stability of the environment. So for example, with our corals, these hard corals that we have right here, which we remember are called hermatypic corals, they are extracting this calcium carbonate from the water and they are building their skeletons, which is kind of forming this really complex structure. Let's imagine these two together here. These are next to each other out on the reef. We can see there's lots and lots of kind of hidey holes underneath here. There's lots of different places where different creatures can live. And this just really goes to show that without the structure that a hermatypic hard coral actually provides, it actually means there wouldn't be any homes for any of the other creatures to live on the reef. So for example, all the different fish species that we have, all the different invertebrate species as well. Speaking of some of our key mobile invertebrates that we have here, let's think about the big snails like the queen conch and the lobster. They all need this structure in order to be able to survive and to live. And the same kind of goes for us humans as well. Let's think of two different areas that are the exact same size. We have one area that is over here, which is a city. And we have one area over here, which is a desert. Now inside the city, there's lots of different homes, lots of different buildings, lots of different resources for example, food, for people to be able to live and to survive. However, if we compare this area right here, which is our desert, not as many people are going to be able to survive. And this is kind of the exact same thing that we're seeing here on coral reefs. Coral reefs are essentially the cities of the underwater world. And that's why, even though coral reefs cover less than 1% of the ocean, actually 25% of all marine life lives inside of there. That is a huge amount. That's absolutely crazy. The fact that they're in such a small area, but so much life lives inside of them. The exact same thing for our cities as well. They're quite small, but lots and lots of people can live inside of them. And that is because they provide the structure, they provide the homes and resources for all the different humans or creatures to live. And this is why it is so important for us to make sure that we're putting our corals back onto the reef, because they are providing this structure and they're providing this home for all of the other creatures. And they're not necessarily doing that by just hanging in our coral nursery. Now, because they are providing all these different structures and lots of different creatures can live inside of them, this actually means that because of the coral reef structure that we have, that there is actually lots of creatures that live there, and that means there's lots of things called food chains. Now, what is a food chain? A food chain is a really simple way of explaining how energy flows through a system. So a really nice simple one that we have, let's think of a terrestrial example. We have grass that grows, and then potentially a snail will come along and it will eat some of the grass. And then a bird is going to come along and the bird is going to eat the snail. And then an even larger bird will come along and eat the original bird. So that's showing how the energy that started in that grass is actually moving through the whole ecosystem. And the exact same thing is happening on our coral reefs, because the corals are providing the initial homes for those creatures to be able to live. So I know that on your at-home activity sheet, we actually have a nice little food chain activity that you can be doing, where we're looking at some of the different food chains and the flow of energy that we find in coral reefs. And we have one example on there that even starts with the coral itself, with the zooxanthellae that lives inside of its tissues. So at the bottom of the food chain is the zooxanthellae, then a snail will eat that, and then a crab will eat the snail, and then an octopus will eat the crab, and a shark will come and eat the octopus. And that's showing how the energy is moving through there. And the key thing that I really want to have as a take-home message from this is that the more structure, so the more corals that are on the reef that are nice and healthy, means that more creatures can live there, and it means the healthier the coral reef ecosystem is. If you have lots of healthy corals on your reef, then that means you're going to have lots and lots of the predators that are at the top of those food chains. So healthier corals in a coral reef setting means more sharks normally, or more barracudas, and the healthier the whole ecosystem is, which is really, really cool. And as I said, this is why we really want to take our corals from our coral nursery and put them back in their natural environment, to make sure the natural environment is healthy as a whole ecosystem. So with that being said, we're now going to switch over to Katie, who is going to teach us how to outplant some of our corals onto the coral reef. So take it away, Katie.
Why don't you students come with me? Some of our safety divers had actually set up a special area right next to this coral nursery just so that you students can see what outplanting a coral is really like. So I'm just going to grab my bag of tools here and we can get started. Alright, so before we can outplant the coral, you students saw how we cleaned the corals, we measured them for total linear extension. We also want to make sure to pick corals that look 100% healthy, and then we know what their genetic history is or what their family is like. So on a lot of these corals, you may notice they have a bead that's a different color. This coral has a black bead, this coral has a yellow bead, and this coral has a green bead. Each of these beads signifies a different family that coral came from. So that's something that we want to make sure to record before we outplant. Now I've got two corals here that were ready for outplanting. Let's see, I believe it's these two here. Yep. Alright, so these are the two corals that we're going to outplant today, and as you can see, they don't have a bead. These are corals that we found in our nursery as broken fragments, just kind of rolling around on the ground, and we don't know what family they came from. So we call them unknown genotypes, or they're from unknown family. So they have no bead associated with them. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to use these wire cutters to cut the coral as close as possible at the base, trying to leave as much of that monofilament line behind as possible. There we go. while our videographer Drew is getting things set up in the outplant area. Now, we are going to need some tools for this outplanting. So I'm going to make sure to take out our data sheet here, the same data sheet that you students use for your total linear extension. And then I'm going to take this big brush here. Now I do want to say, first things first, that this is a outplant site that was allowed, that we as CCMI are allowed to outplant to on the natural reef from a permit from the Department of Environment. So it may look like this is harmful to the reef, but overall this is for the benefit of the reef. So I'm going to clean around these nails to make it free of any algae. This is that bad algae we were talking about that competes with the coral directly. And we just want to make sure that the area we're outplanting to is totally free from any algae or sponges or encrusting algae that may make it hard for that coral to grow into the structure. Now, after we've cleaned it really well, we're going to use a 2-part marine epoxy, just sort of like an underwater glue. It's 2 different colors, just barely. One is a little more gray than the other, one's a little bit creamy or white colored. And I'm just gonna mix those up really, really well into what's called a homogeneous mixture. So homogeneous mixture means that you just can't tell the difference between the colors anymore. It all looks the same. Until it starts to give off this kind of smoky look, then you know that the underwater glue is about ready to use. It starts to get a little more easier to mix together as well, a little more malleable, and it feels kind of like silly putty. I don't know if you guys actually still have silly putty or if that was totally a thing when I was a kid, but I think it might still be. Okay, so now you can see it's smoking pretty good to the point where you probably can't even see my face anymore. And you only need a little amount, maybe the size of a Hershey's Kiss. And I'm gonna put it on the side of these nails, just at the very, very base there. And I've got a bit of extra that I can keep on the side, just in case. And then we're gonna take a zip tie, and we're going to zip tie this coral in place. So we squish the coral as best we can into that epoxy, and then wrap this zip tie. If we can get 2 on there, we'll try. Actually, we may only need 1 for this one. There we go. And you gotta zip tie that coral in place on that nail as tightly as you can. You're gonna pull that zip tie really hard. Okay? Because you don't want that coral to be able to move around at all, because what's gonna happen is the coral tissue is going to grow over that zip tie. So it's not gonna harm the coral at all. The coral is gonna think that this zip tie is now a part of its internal skeleton, and it's going to grow its tissue right over it as fast as maybe a week or two from now. Now this epoxy, you got to push up into those coral polyps on the bottom so that it gets deep inside the coral skeleton, and then again all around the base. Because same with the zip tie, the coral is going to think that this is part of its skeleton and grow over it fairly quickly. Alright, and the last step is you want to trim this zip tie, because the more zip tie there is, the more algae is actually going to grow on it. There we go. Alright. So that coral is now outplanted onto the reef, and will probably overgrow this zip tie and the nail and that epoxy on the bottom in maybe just a month or two. So not very long at all.
Okay everyone, welcome back. That was a fantastic demonstration by Katie on how to outplant some of the corals onto the reef. She showed one of the key methods that we use, where obviously we get a nail that we hammer into the reef, a bit of marine epoxy where we shove that coral fragment in, and then zip tying all the way around it. Now, this is one of the most common methods that you'll actually find in coral outplanting, because it doesn't require that many resources and it is relatively simple to do. But we do actually have several other ways that we are outplanting corals onto the coral reef. Now, for those of you that have been watching, you may have been wondering what is going on behind me with this very strange structure that I have right here. I'm just going to lift this up and attempt not to take myself out with it. So what we have here is we actually have a coral dome. So this is very, very interesting, and it's made out of rebar, which is, just some nice metal that we've actually covered in some sand here. So it's given a little bit of texture as well, and will stop it from rusting underwater. So when we were speaking about our coral nursery, before we were saying that the coral is hanging in this nice kind of safe environment. It's got lots of water around it. It's less likely to get a disease, less likely to be predated on, for example. But what happens when we use that first method that Katie showed us is we handle this coral quite a lot, which we all know can actually be quite stressful for a coral. So we're kind of stressing the coral out a little bit, and then we're obviously putting the coral straight onto the reef like this, right next to the bottom where we are going to find predators. We are going to have lots of sand, which can cause disease because there's lots of microbes, for example, inside of it. So actually the survival rate of some of those outplants actually isn't as high as if we would use our dome method that we have right here. So these domes, what we do is we actually put them down onto the reef, we let them settle for a little bit, and then what we do is, using zip ties, we will once again zip tie the corals onto this nice little frame that we have right here, and we'll put lots and lots of them all around this dome. Now this dome then is holding the corals a little bit off the substrate, which means that it's less likely, for example, to be predated upon, less likely to get, microbes and disease on it. So it actually means that it's still in a little bit of a safer sort of nursery-like environment. And because of this, by using this method, we're actually having a much higher survival rate with these than we have been with our traditional outplants that Katie actually showed earlier. So we did a study, we put some of these out onto the reef as a project, and what we found is that after 5 months, there was 100% survival rate. However, with the traditional outplants that we had, after 5 months, we only had a 37 to 41% survival rate. So that is a huge, huge, huge difference. Now, it's not just us that's having, some issues with the traditional outplant method here in the Caribbean. They just, in all honesty, they don't have the highest survival rates. But hopefully, by undertaking outplants like this and using these domes, we know that our corals are actually going to be more likely to survive once we put them out onto the reef. So what we're trying to do is we're actually going to be continuing with this project right here. And we have lots of domes that we have built recently. Some of our team have learned how to weld, which has been a very exciting skill for them. And we've got 60 of these now, which we're going to be trying to put out in different locations around the island. And we're going to be studying how they do. So once all of the travel restrictions have been lifted here in the Cayman Islands, we can't wait to get back out onto the boat and continue our research, which is going to be super fun. So this also actually links in to one of the activities on your sheets that you have been given, where you actually get the opportunity to make your own coral dome like this. Now, I said in the first week, please don't judge me for my terrible arts and crafts skills. I'm going to say I'm a scientist and I'm not very good at arts. But you can see here that I have actually taken lots and lots of little toothpicks. I have sellotaped them together and I've made my very own dome, which actually looks relatively similar to this one that we have right here. And I have stuck my corals onto it. So if you want to do this activity sheet, then please do make one of these and make sure to send us some pictures of it. We would love to see all of your coral domes that you have made at home, and you can put a picture of that on our Facebook page, or you can email it to education@reefresearch.org, and I will try and respond to some of those, and the best ones that we find we'll put on social media. So I want there to be a competition to see who can make the best one. So we've learned about some of the different outplanting techniques that we've had. We've learned how we actually want to outplant and why we want to do it in the first place. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some of the questions that were asked to us during our live broadcast, where you potentially couldn't quite understand my answers due to our very annoying technical difficulties. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start going through some of the ones that we've already had coming through. So we have one that came in through from Ron, who was asking what percentage of the corals survived after outplanting. So I already let you know the answer to that one, Ron. But essentially we have, after 5 months or so, 100% survival on these and about 37 to 41% survival on the original outplanting technique that we spoke about. And the reason why it's quite low is because, as I said, the corals are getting quite stressed. We are handling them, we are putting them out onto the reef in direct contact with that bottom of the reef, which is where things can kind of come along and damage them. And this is something that we're finding Caribbean wide. So not the best success rate, but we are working on lots of really cool new methods like this one right here. Okay, we also have a question that has come in from Emma, who is asking what percentage of the coral is actually lost to the epoxy that you're using? That is an excellent question, Emma, and it's actually really not that much. All we're essentially trying to do is put a blob of epoxy and kind of shove the coral in just a little bit. So it's probably only going to be about 1 centimetre or 2, which is actually going to be covered by the epoxy. But we do still want to use this, as it does kind of create a nice stable base for the coral to be on. And then obviously we will have the nail here and the zip tie, keeping it extra secure. But we're not really losing too much to the epoxy. Recently, however, we have actually just not been using epoxy at all. I know that you asked another question, Emma, saying, is there a more eco-friendly alternative? Well, we've actually found recently that the marine epoxy is not really doing anything for us. It's not really keeping anything more stable. And so instead, we've actually just been using nails and zip ties, which obviously does make this more environmentally friendly on the reef. And yeah, that's kind of the best way that we're trying to make it as environmentally friendly as possible, and just trying to make sure that we're not having a negative impact on the environment. So thank you for those fantastic questions, Emma. We really appreciate you sending those through. Okay, we have a question that's come in now from Kira, who's asking, is there a difference in coral resilience to bleaching and disease depending on the water depth? So that is a fantastic question, Kira, and thank you so much for sending that through. What I'm going to speak about first of all is I'm going to speak about bleaching, and then I'll chat a little bit about disease afterwards. So yes, there is a difference in coral resilience in regards to bleaching depending on what depth the coral is grown at. So we actually used to have a really shallow coral nursery. So I've been speaking a lot about the deep coral nursery, which is right behind me here. And that's in around 60 feet, 18 meters of water. But we also had a shallow nursery that was in around 10 feet or 3 meters of water, which was just down at the east end of the island here. Now what we found, because we were also growing stagcorn coral in that shallow nursery as well, what we found is that obviously in that shallow water, it got a lot hotter than you would find in the deeper water. Now this means that the corals were actually bleaching way more frequently than they were in the deeper nursery. However, what we found is that after the corals have been bleached the initial time, actually the next time they were generally more resistant to bleaching than they had been in the past. And this is actually quite a common method, and lots of research is kind of going on in this area at the moment, is that if you are growing corals in a coral nursery in stressful conditions, for example, they are getting hot, they are bleaching, then actually what you're doing is you're kind of making sure that you're growing relatively bleaching resistant corals, which means that when you put them back out onto the reef, if there is a bleaching event, then they're probably going to be more able to survive that bleaching event compared to corals that have, for example, been grown in the deep nursery. So yes, there is a difference in the resilience to bleaching depending on where the corals are grown. But what we do have to remember is that not all corals obviously survive this first level of bleaching, and we actually had quite a lot of death in our shallow nursery, which is why we have recently closed it, because there was quite a lot of mortality that we had recently. So we've now moved everything into our deep nursery. In regards to disease, that doesn't really seem to have an impact actually on the disease that we're finding. Diseases are still so relatively unknown, and we really do not know anything about them. And we do know that if a coral is more stressed out, then it is more susceptible to getting a disease. So if a coral is in shallow water and it is bleaching a lot, then it is more susceptible to getting a disease and dying. But in terms of resilience, the water depth doesn't really seem to actually be having an impact with this. So no, it doesn't appear to us at the moment with the research that we are conducting that there is more resilience in either deeper or shallow water in regards to coral disease. So, but that would be a really interesting research project for us to be able to potentially look at in the future. So thank you for sending that question in, Kira. That was a fantastic question. Okay, we have another question that's come in now from Ron. And Ron is asking, does the influx of lionfish in the Cayman Islands have an effect on reef health? Thank you for that wonderful question, Ron. And for those of you that are viewing that don't quite know about the invasive lionfish in the Caribbean, lionfish are actually native to the Indo-Pacific region. So let's think about Australia, the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, etc. That is where they live in the world. But we actually have invasive lionfish here, which is mean they are brought here from another area and they're having a negative impact on the environment. And we think that lionfish actually got into the Caribbean region because of the aquarium trade, because people brought the lionfish over to have in their aquariums because they're beautiful, beautiful creatures. But then unfortunately, because lionfish eat essentially everything in sight and they're not fussy about what they eat at all, they kind of ate everything inside of the fish tanks. So people were like, okay, I'm going to get rid of my lionfish. I'm going to put it back in the ocean where it belongs, for example. So essentially they managed to get into the Caribbean Sea And because they do eat absolutely everything that they possibly can, they are having a really significant impact on reef health. So the smaller juvenile lionfish, they tend to really like eating invertebrates such as shrimp and crabs, etc. And then the larger lionfish really like eating lots of the common fish that we find around here. And what is really amazing about lionfish is, one, that they can actually eat themselves until they are completely gorged and full, and they can put down lots and lots of fat deposits. And two, is that a lionfish can eat something that is half of its body length in one mouthful, and it kind of sucks it in like a Hoover or a vacuum cleaner and doesn't even chew it, it just sucks it all in. So they're really good at eating a lot of things, and that's how they're having a really significant impact on reef health. So we spoke a lot about food chains earlier. These lionfish are coming in and they're eating lots of different creatures that are from different points of the food chain. And this is disrupting the whole system, and meaning that the ecosystem can't function as it's supposed to. So this, yes, is having a really negative impact on coral reef health. And that is why here in the Cayman Islands, the Department of Environment works really, really hard in conjunction with lots of different partners to try and remove those lionfish via the community spearing program. And if you want to learn more about that, then definitely head over to the Cayman Islands Department of Environment website. So thank you for that wonderful question, Ron. Okay, we have one final question that I'm going to answer, and that's coming from Cal. And Cal is asking, do parrotfish also eat the frames and the concrete? Thank you for that excellent question, Cal. And that's a really interesting one, actually. The parrotfish don't necessarily eat the frames themselves and the concrete themselves, but they do like eating the algae that grows on top of the coral frames and on top of concrete, for example. So you may see some parrotfish definitely down in our coral nursery. You'll see some parrotfish that are kind of chomping away and eating all of that algae. Now, even though these fish are eating the algae that is growing on our coral frames, it is still really important for us to clean them, because the algae is growing so fast that the fish actually can't get rid of all of it. So although the fish are eating some of the algae, we are having to kind of clean the frames quite a lot as well. But the parrotfish aren't necessarily actually eating the frames and the concrete themselves. So thank you for that lovely question, Cal. And I think that is it for us and all of our questions. We didn't get that many through during our live broadcast because I know we had some really bad audio issues and it was a little bit jumpy. If anyone watching this has any more questions that I haven't already answered, then please do just write a comment on here and with your question, and I will try and answer them as best as I can. Or you can email through those questions to education@reefresearch.org. Likewise, if you want to undertake any of our activity sheets, so you can build your own coral dome here, you can also build your own food chain, then please do that and then send through some pictures to us, because we would love to share on social media what our amazing viewers are doing at home, especially since we're all trapped at home during this isolation. All right, guys, thank you so much for joining us. It has been lovely to speak to you all today, and I hope that we get to speak soon in the future and have a few more classes. Thanks so much for joining us. I've had a lovely morning with you all. Thanks a lot. Bye.